I'm Anne Faulkner, and I'm here today to tell you about my experience of C.diff. I got C.diff in 2007. Prior to that, I was in reasonably good health, fairly fit and well, but I returned from holiday in the south of France with a mosquito bite on my ankle which was infected, and my doctor prescribed some antibiotics. Prior to that, I'd always been quite a fan of antibiotics because particularly in my late teens, early 20s, I had a lot of tonsillitis. I had my tonsils out when I was 21. And so I saw antibiotics as a good thing. Initially, I had what I thought, and I probably still do think, was a normal stomach bug that was going around at work. So I became ill with sickness and diarrhoea. And I think after a fortnight my GP did do a stool sample because it wasn't going away, but it came back negative. But then about 3 weeks into the illness, I was still feeling very sick. I distinctly remember one Thursday evening ringing my partner who'd gone out for the night to say, "You'll have to come home." And I was literally that night lying on the bathroom floor, heaving into a bucket, both ends. It was horrible. And I also remember saying, "I just don't know what's wrong with me, but I feel as though I've been poisoned." And that's just how it felt, as though my whole body had been poisoned, and it was just rejecting anything that I took. The next day I went to my GP, and she took one look at me, took bloods, told us to get a stool sample to the hospital straight away. And that was a Friday. I remember she rang about 5:30 and said, "You've got C.diff." I'd never heard of C.diff. I didn't know what it was, so she had to explain what it was. And even though that was a bank holiday weekend, she was absolutely marvellous. She gave me the option of going into hospital or staying at home, which I chose to stay at home. And she rang me every day for about 5 or 6 days just to check I was okay, to check that I wasn't getting dehydrated. And just generally to make sure I was going in the right direction. She also prescribed, oddly enough, an antibiotic to treat the C.diff. I can't remember the exact name, but it began with an M. And I took that for about a month. The way C.diff affects you is you feel very, very nauseous. You have diarrhoea. Even when I hadn't got diarrhoea, I'd sort of walk around and have the feeling I needed to go to the loo. But you also feel incredibly tired and you want to sleep. It just makes you feel very, very physically low, and it's very draining, so after a while I lost weight, etc. But after a month on these antibiotics, both my GP and I thought that it had cured it, so I stopped taking the antibiotics, and I thought, great, C.diff's been beaten. But then literally within about 24, 48 hours, the symptoms came back with a vengeance. And at that point, she prescribed a second antibiotic, which I do know the name of. That was vancomycin. That would probably be the end of September, and I continued on vancomycin all through October, November, and almost up to Christmas that year. So I was on vancomycin for about 3 months. The physical symptoms, had you had them just for a week, you probably would be okay. It was similar to having a stomach bug, although perhaps more stomach pain. But when you have it month after month, I was feeling very, very nauseous, had quite a lot of diarrhoea, loose bowel movements over sort of a 4 to 5 month period. I can remember sitting down, and if my partner hadn't actually made meals for me and made me eat them, I don't think I would have wanted to eat at all. And the trouble was, every time I ate something I felt worse afterwards. So that in itself meant that I lost quite a lot of weight. I went down, I'm not huge, but I went down to about 7 stone, dropped a couple of dress sizes. So physically I just felt very weakened by the illness. On top of that, I think psychologically it did have a big impact on me. It was a very frightening illness to have, because I wasn't sure what it was to begin with, and I wasn't sure that the vancomycin would work. Unfortunately, I had heard that some strains of C. diff can be antibiotic resistant, and I don't know how I'd have coped without my partner, a really brilliant GP, and Jill Marriott, the infection control disease nurse, who was really, really helpful, and on the other end of the phone if I had any worries. I think to begin with, because of course you're aware of the fact that you've got something that is an infectious disease, so you're sort of being very careful to use lots of bleach and clean the toilet and things. But for instance, at the time I had elderly parents who I was partly responsible for looking after. Whilst I was ill, my dad fell and broke his hip, and the rest of the family asked me, quite rightly, not to have contact with them because we didn't want them in their frail state to potentially be in contact with me with the C. diff, at least for the first couple of months. So it's quite isolating. But I think the main thing was, I guess it's like whenever you're faced with a pretty serious illness, you do start to become a bit anxious about what the eventual outcome will be. And that doesn't really stop immediately that the C. diff has gone away either, because I had to see a dietitian, I had to go on to a complete low fibre diet. It was the only way we could get any control back in my bowels before I returned to work. It was about 15 months before I was able to start to eat a normal diet and, could say that things had completely settled down. So you kind of do have a reminder of it even after the illness itself has gone. Plus, I am left with the advice that the gastroenterologist gave me, which I know is right, which is avoid antibiotics like the plague in future. So now, if I become ill, I am quite concerned that I might need to take antibiotics, particularly the broad-spectrum antibiotics. Again, I'm very fortunate that my GP is very understanding and is totally aware of the situation. But I do know there probably are some illnesses that I could get where I'll be faced with the choice of taking broad spectrum and potentially the C. diff coming back, which is something I never ever really want to have to go through again. I can totally understand why somebody who is, I was in good health, relatively young when I got it, how somebody who is elderly or very unwell when they contract C. diff, it just defeats them. I'd just like to say to GPs and anyone else prescribing, please think carefully before you prescribe antibiotics. I know there must be many occasions when it is the only option, but please think about the type of antibiotic you're prescribing, the length of course you're prescribing. I also am aware that, we patients often come in with the expectation of getting antibiotics. I think maybe I've done that in the past, but obviously I can see now that there is another side to this story, and I really wouldn't want even my worst enemy to go through C. diff, because it is a very, very nasty illness.